Cowboy saw Apache humiliated at dawn, and the shadow on the ridge demanded justice tonight. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jack Thompson had lived his life as a solitary cowboy, a man who sought peace in the open plains, far away from the bustle of towns and the cruelty of the world. His past, filled with loss and regret, had shaped him into someone who preferred the company of his horse and the wind over any human being. But that morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, he found himself witnessing something that would change his life forever. On the distant hill, just beyond the ridge, he saw a figure, an Apache woman, Ayanna, standing tall, her head bowed in shame, surrounded by a group of men who mocked and humiliated her. Jack's heart clenched at the sight. He knew enough about the tensions between the settlers and the Native Americans, but he had never seen such cruelty firsthand. His eyes narrowed as he watched Ayanna, her eyes full of defiance yet tinged with sorrow, as she endured the words and gestures meant to break her spirit. Jack wanted to ride over there, to rush to her aid, but something held him back. He wasn't sure if it was fear, or perhaps the grim knowledge that stepping in would put him in the middle of a fight he wasn't prepared for. But then something shifted. A shadow moved on the ridge, just beyond the clearing where Ayanna stood. Jack squinted, trying to make out the figure, and his heart skipped a beat as he realized what it was. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, but there was no mistaking the sense of power that radiated from it. The shadow moved with purpose, and Jack knew, instinctively, that this was no ordinary person. This was a force, a presence that demanded attention. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped into the light, revealing a face marked by years of battle, a face that held both wisdom and wrath. It was clear now, this was no simple observer. This was someone who had come to deliver justice. As Jack watched in stunned silence, he realized that the time for hesitation had passed. The shadow on the ridge had made its move, and now Ayanna's fate, and his own, were about to be decided in a way either of them could have foreseen. The sense of justice that hung in the air was palpable, and Jack knew that whatever came next, it would change everything. The winds that swept across the plains whispered of battles fought and victories won, of wrongs righted and the undeniable force of fate. Jack tightened his grip on his reins, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that this was a moment he could not ignore. It was time to stand for what was right. As the shadow on the ridge approached, Jack Thompson's heart began to race. He had seen many things in his life, but nothing had prepared him for what he was witnessing now. The figure that moved toward him wasn't just a symbol of vengeance. It was something more powerful, more resolute. The figure's presence seemed to pull at the very air around him, making it difficult for Jack to focus on anything else. His instincts told him this was a turning point, a moment when the world would shift on its axis. Ayanna, still standing in the clearing, hadn't noticed the figure yet. She was too focused on the men who were mocking her, their words cutting through the silence like daggers. Jack felt a sharp pang of guilt. He should have done something sooner, but now it seemed like fate had placed him at the crossroads. He could not ignore the justice that was about to unfold. As the figure drew closer, Jack could see it more clearly. The man was tall, his silhouette strong and commanding. He walked with the kind of confidence that came only from a life of struggle and survival. There was something about the way he moved, as though he were not just walking through the land but asserting his dominance over it. Jack knew instinctively that this was not a person to be trifled with. The figure's eyes locked onto Ayanna, and for the first time since he had witnessed the humiliation, Jack saw a shift in the air. The mocking group of men began to sense it too. The winds picked up, carrying the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. They were coming, fast, and the men's demeanor shifted from confidence to uncertainty. They had not expected this. The shadow that loomed on the ridge was not a mere man, it was a force of nature, and its arrival was a harbinger of change. Jack's grip on his reins tightened as he watched the scene unfold. There was no going back now. He could feel the tension building, like the stillness before a storm. Ayanna, unaware of the looming presence, continued to endure the taunts thrown at her. But Jack knew that would not last for long. As the shadows stepped into the clearing, the men began to falter. One by one, their words became quieter, their movements slower. It was as though they recognized the inevitability of what was about to happen. The man who had been leading the humiliation, Marshal Clayton, took a step back, his eyes flicking nervously toward the figure. The atmosphere had shifted, and he knew it. The shadow was not just here to watch, it was here to right a wrong. Jack felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. Could this be the moment when justice was finally served? As the figure stood tall, the silence was broken only by the wind and the distant hooves of approaching riders. The tension in the air was palpable. Ayanna, still unaware of the full weight of what was happening, took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she prepared to face whatever came next. And then, with a voice that cut through the silence like a blade, the figure spoke. Enough. The word echoed across the land, and the men who had taunted Ayanna froze. It was clear to them now that they were no longer in control of the situation. The shadow on the ridge had arrived, and with it came the promise of justice. The silence that followed the figure's command was thick, almost suffocating. Jack Thompson could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, and for a moment, he thought time itself had slowed. The men who had once surrounded Ayanna, mocking her, now seemed smaller, their confidence deflated like air leaking from a balloon. Even Marshal Clayton, the leader of the group, who had been the loudest in his insults, was frozen in place, his eyes wide with uncertainty. The shadow on the ridge, the mysterious figure who had descended like a storm on the wind, stood tall, unwavering, as if the very land itself had aligned to give him strength. Jack's pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had come to witness a moment of cruelty, but now, he was witnessing something far more profound. The shadow was not just a man, he was an embodiment of justice, a force that could not be ignored. The figure moved forward with a purpose, his eyes locking onto Marshal Clayton, who now seemed to shrink under the weight of the gaze. The stillness was broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the grass, and the distant, rhythmic pounding of horses' hooves. Ayanna, still unaware of the full scope of what was happening, stood motionless, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She had endured the taunts, the insults, the humiliation. But now, in the face of the mysterious figure's presence, she could sense that something had changed. The men who had once taunted her now stood frozen, their bravado crumbling into something more resembling fear. The figure approached with deliberate steps, and for a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. As he neared the group, his voice rang out again, deep and commanding. "Leave her be," he said, his words carrying an authority that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. His voice was not a threat but a declaration. A promise that whatever had been done to Ayanna would not stand. Jack Thompson watched in awe as the group of men hesitated. Marshal Clayton, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver, shifted uneasily. He had always been a man who thrived on intimidation, but in the face of this stranger, he was no longer sure of his next move. The figure's presence was overwhelming, like the calm before a storm, and it was clear that this was not a confrontation that could be avoided. "You will answer for this," the figure continued, his gaze never leaving Clayton. "Not today, perhaps, but the time will come when you will face the consequences of your actions." Jack could feel the air growing thicker with anticipation. It wasn't just the words of the stranger that made the men uneasy. It was the certainty in his voice, the undeniable truth that what was about to happen would be something they couldn't escape. Ayanna, still unaware of the full gravity of the situation, stood quietly, her head slightly tilted, waiting for what would come next. Her posture was one of quiet strength, the same strength that had carried her through the humiliation, but now there was something new in the air. A sense of justice, of balance, was beginning to take root. It was as if the land itself had decided that enough was enough. Jack Thompson knew this moment would be remembered. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. The man on the ridge, the shadow that had arrived with the first light of dawn, was not just seeking justice for Ayanna. He was seeking something far greater, a restoration of balance, a return to what was right. And in that moment, Jack knew that this was a battle not of violence, but of truth. A truth that could not be silenced by fear, or intimidation, or cruelty. As the figure's presence loomed larger, Jack felt the weight of his own choice. He had witnessed the injustice. He had watched as Ayanna had been humiliated. But now, in the face of the shadow, he saw the possibility of something more, a chance to right the wrongs of the past and stand for what was just. The tension in the air grew thicker with every passing second as the figure on the ridge stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the clearing. Marshal Clayton, still standing in the midst of the group, was now visibly rattled. He had been used to being in control, used to having the power to bully and intimidate, but now, in the face of the mysterious figure, all of his bravado seemed to evaporate. The shadow that had loomed over the ridge was no longer just a man, it was a force of nature, a symbol of something much larger than himself. Clayton took a step back, his hand instinctively moving towards the revolver holstered at his side. But before he could reach it, the figure spoke again, his voice steady and calm, but filled with an undeniable authority. "You have no power here," the figure said, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. "Your actions will be judged, not by you, but by those you have wronged." There was a pause, a moment where everything seemed to freeze in place. The men who had once surrounded Ayanna, taunting her, now stood still, their eyes flicking nervously between the figure and their leader. They had expected to see the figure falter, to see him back down, but instead, they saw someone who stood firm, unshaken by the fear that gripped them. Jack Thompson, still hidden in the distance, felt a sense of awe wash over him. He had been a witness to many moments of injustice in his life, but never before had he seen such a clear moment of righteous defiance. The figure's words seemed to echo across the land, a call for justice that could not be ignored. Ayanna, still standing in the clearing, looked up slowly, her eyes locking onto the figure. She had endured so much already, but now, in this moment, she saw something she had not expected: hope. The figure had come to her aid, not out of pity, but out of a deep sense of justice. He had recognized the wrong done to her, and had come to set it right. As she stood there, feeling the weight of the moment, she realized that this was not just about her. It was about something larger, something that transcended her personal pain. This was about the idea that no one should be humiliated or wronged without consequence. The figure's gaze never wavered from Marshal Clayton, who had taken a few more steps back, his eyes darting around as though searching for a way out. Clayton had been the one to instigate the cruelty, the one to humiliate Ayanna in front of her people. But now, as the figure's gaze pinned him in place, Clayton knew that he could no longer escape the reality of what he had done. Jack felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized that this was the moment of reckoning. This was the turning point where everything would change. The figure on the ridge had come to restore balance, to make sure that justice would prevail. The men who had stood by and allowed Ayanna to be humiliated now found themselves confronted by something they could not fight. The figure had become the embodiment of the very justice they had long denied. As the silence stretched on, Jack felt the air shift once more. It was as though the earth itself had taken a deep breath, waiting for the final act to unfold. Ayanna, still standing in the clearing, now saw the full picture. She had not been abandoned. She had not been forgotten. The figure had come for her, and with him, he carried the promise of justice. It was not just about a single act of cruelty, but about the larger fight for honor, for respect, and for a future where the wrongs of the past would be righted. In that moment, Ayanna knew that her suffering would not go unanswered. The shadow on the ridge had not just come to watch, it had come to demand the justice that was long overdue. The stillness in the air grew heavier as the figure on the ridge stepped forward, his presence commanding every ounce of attention in the clearing. Marshal Clayton, still standing at the front of his group, had been calculating his next move, but now, the uncertainty in his eyes was undeniable. The power that had once been his, the authority he had wielded over Ayanna and those like her, was slipping away, replaced by a deep and palpable fear. The shadow, now a solid form before him, had come to challenge everything Clayton had believed in. "You have taken much from those who cannot fight back." The figure's voice rang out, calm but unyielding. "But the time of your reign is over." Jack Thompson, hidden just beyond the trees, couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene. The figure on the ridge, towering and resolute, was not merely a man, he was a symbol. Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had watched too many injustices pass by without doing anything. But now, with this man, this force, demanding justice for Ayanna, Jack knew that something had to change. The group of men that had once stood proudly, ready to carry out their cruelty, now seemed lost, like hunters who had been caught in a trap they never expected. Clayton, still gripping his revolver, shifted his weight uneasily, glancing at his men for support. But none of them dared to move. The figure on the ridge had taken command of the space, and no one, not even Clayton, could challenge that. Ayanna, who had remained silent this entire time, stood tall and unyielding. Her heart, once heavy with the weight of her humiliation, now began to fill with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The figure was not just a savior, he was justice, and his arrival had ignited a fire in her that had been buried beneath years of fear and pain. The figure continued to speak, each word cutting through the tension. "I've come to make sure that your actions will not go unanswered," he declared. "You will not take another step without knowing that justice will be your shadow from now on." Clayton's face hardened, his pride flaring up despite the situation. "I don't know who you are," he spat, his voice shaking. "But you have no right to speak to me like that." The figure didn't flinch. "I have every right," he said simply. "Because I stand for the truth." Clayton stepped forward, still defiant, but it was clear to Jack that his courage was faltering. Ayanna's eyes, still locked on the figure, moved briefly to Jack's direction. She couldn't see him, but she felt the weight of his presence. He had been a witness, a silent one, but now, in this moment, he could no longer remain passive. Jack took a deep breath and stepped forward, his heart beating in his chest like a war drum. He had been an observer for far too long, but now, he was ready to act. As he approached, he caught Ayanna's eye. For the first time in a long while, she smiled, the smallest curve of her lips, but it was enough to ignite something inside of him. This was more than just a fight for her. It was a fight for all those who had been wrong. The figure on the ridge turned his gaze to Jack, nodding in silent acknowledgement. There was no need for words. The time for words had passed. The air around them seemed to hum with anticipation, the promise of what was to come clear to everyone present. The shadow had arrived, and now, with the figure's strength, justice would finally be served. The men who had once held power were now on the verge of losing it, their actions unraveling in the face of what was right. And for the first time, Jack Thompson felt as though he were standing on the right side of history. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation as the figure on the ridge held his ground, the embodiment of justice standing unwavering before the group of men who had once been so sure of their power. Marshal Clayton, still shaken, took a hesitant step back, his eyes darting from the mysterious figure to his own men. It was clear now that the balance had shifted, and with each passing moment, the weight of his actions grew heavier. The figure had come, not just to confront them, but to force them to reckon with the consequences of their cruelty. Jack Thompson, standing just behind the trees, felt the pressure in his chest lift ever so slightly. He had been a passive observer for too long, but now, in the face of this reckoning, he found his courage returning. He stepped forward, quietly, not wanting to draw attention but knowing that this was the moment he had been waiting for. Ayanna, standing tall despite the humiliation she had endured, finally allowed herself to breathe a little easier. The shadow of justice had arrived, and with it, the strength she had been longing for. She felt a shift in the energy around her, as though the land itself had recognized the arrival of something greater than fear or hatred. The figure spoke again, his voice calm but powerful, reaching everyone within earshot. "This ends now," he declared. "The wrongs done here will be righted, and no more shall suffer in silence." His words were not just a declaration, they were a promise. A promise to Ayanna and to everyone who had ever been oppressed, humiliated, or cast aside. Marshal Clayton, who had once been so certain of his dominance, now found himself trembling, his hand still resting on the hilt of his revolver but no longer sure of what to do with it. The men who had once followed his lead were now looking at him, their faces full of doubt. The power they had once felt was slipping through their fingers, replaced by the overwhelming force of justice that was bearing down on them. Clayton took another step back, his gaze still fixed on the figure but now flicking nervously toward the men behind him. He could feel their uncertainty as well, the unity that had once bound them together beginning to unravel. But the figure, steady and unflinching, did not back down. "You will leave here now," the figure said, his words clear and final. "You will answer for your actions, but not today. Today, the truth will come to light, and justice will be restored." The tension in the air seemed to crackle, and for the first time, Clayton realized that there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming. His pride, his cruelty, and his belief in his own power had led him to this moment, and now, there was no escape. The men who had once been his allies stood in silence, no longer willing to follow him. They had seen the power of the figure on the ridge, and they knew that the tide had turned. Slowly, one by one, they began to back away, their eyes downcast, their shoulders slumped in defeat. Jack could see it now. The justice that had seemed so far out of reach was finally becoming a reality. Ayanna, still standing strong, watched as the group of men turned and walked away. She could feel the weight of her own journey lifting, the pain of the past slowly being replaced by a sense of freedom. The shadow of the figure on the ridge had not only come to demand justice for her, it had come to restore the balance that had been lost for so long. As the last of the men disappeared into the distance, Ayanna turned her gaze to Jack, who was now standing beside her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. It was a small smile, but it was enough. Jack smiled back, a feeling of relief washing over him. The moment had come. The wrongs had been righted, and the world felt, for the first time in a long while, like it was shifting in the right direction. As the last of the men disappeared into the distance, the stillness in the air was almost surreal. The tension that had gripped the land for so long began to dissipate, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Ayanna felt a true sense of peace. The shadow on the ridge, the figure who had come to her aid, stood silently by her side, a silent protector whose presence was as grounding as the earth beneath her feet. Jack Thompson, standing next to Ayanna, could feel the weight of the moment. The dust that had been kicked up by the men's departure was slowly settling, just as the weight on his chest seemed to ease. For a man who had lived so long in the shadows of his own regrets, he felt something stirring inside him: hope. The justice that had come today had not just restored balance for Ayanna, it had restored something in him, too. He had witnessed the power of standing up for what was right, and it had made him realize that he, too, could make a difference. Ayanna turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting Jack's for the first time since the figure on the ridge had spoken. Her gaze was no longer filled with the pain of humiliation, it was filled with gratitude and something softer: trust. She had been through so much, but now, standing here, she realized that this moment had marked a turning point in her life. The figure beside her, the one who had acted as her shield, turned to face her. "You are free now," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of unspoken wisdom. "But remember, freedom is not just given, it is earned." Ayanna nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. She had been granted freedom, yes, but it was not just the absence of chains that made her free. It was the courage to stand tall in the face of oppression, to remain true to herself even when the world seemed determined to break her. Jack, standing quietly by her side, couldn't help but feel the weight of those words as well. They weren't just for Ayanna. They were for him, too. In the time he had spent in isolation, he had forgotten what it meant to stand for something greater than himself. Now, in the presence of Ayanna and the figure who had delivered justice, he realized that his own freedom was still waiting to be claimed. As the figure on the ridge began to turn and walk away, Ayanna took a step forward, as if to follow him. But she paused, turning back to Jack. "You helped me today," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "But you also helped yourself. Don't forget that." Jack felt something stir deep within him. It was as though Ayanna had reached inside him and pulled out the very thing he had been hiding from for so long. He had spent years in the shadows, avoiding the world and avoiding the truth of his own actions. But now, as he stood beside Ayanna, he realized that he didn't have to live in fear anymore. He didn't have to hide from the man he could be. He could choose a different path, one where justice and honor were more than just words. The figure on the ridge paused as he reached the edge of the clearing, his silhouette against the sky like a figure from a story long told. He turned his head slightly, as if sensing the change in the air. Without a word, he began to walk toward the horizon, disappearing into the distance as the sun began to set behind him. Ayanna stood still for a moment, watching him go. Then, with a quiet determination, she turned to Jack. "Let's go," she said. And for the first time, Jack felt like he was walking towards something that was not just a future, but a purpose, a future where he could finally stand for what was right, and where Ayanna, too, could walk free, unburdened by the past. As Ayanna and Jack walked side by side, the weight of the past seemed to lift with every step they took. The oppressive silence that had once defined their lives, Ayanna's, filled with humiliation, and Jack's, marked by years of isolation, was now replaced with something new, something hopeful. The air around them felt fresher, like the first breeze after a long drought. For Jack, the journey ahead was not just a physical one, it was a path toward redemption, a road that would allow him to shed the weight of guilt and regret that had kept him locked in his solitude. He had spent so many years thinking that his actions had defined him, that he was nothing more than a collection of mistakes. But now, walking alongside Ayanna, he realized that it was not the past that mattered. It was what he chose to do with the present, with the future. Ayanna, too, was changed. The humiliation she had endured seemed like a distant memory now, something that no longer had power over her. She had faced the darkness, and in the end, it was light that had found its way through. Her journey had been one of survival, but now, it was one of empowerment. She had been given the chance to rise above the cruelty that had once defined her existence. Together, they walked toward a new beginning, their steps in sync, each of them carrying a sense of purpose they hadn't felt before. The landscape around them began to shift as they moved away from the clearing where the confrontation had taken place. The dense woods started to open up into a wide expanse of rolling hills, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. The horizon stretched out before them, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a distant dream, it felt real, tangible. Jack glanced at Ayanna, noticing the quiet determination in her eyes. She had been through so much, yet there was a strength in her that was undeniable. She was no longer the woman who had been humiliated in front of strangers, she was someone who had reclaimed her dignity, her power. "We'll make it," Jack said softly, breaking the silence between them. "We have a future ahead of us, a chance to do things right." Ayanna turned her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "We will," she replied, her voice steady, filled with a calm assurance that Jack had come to admire. The journey was far from over, but they had crossed a significant threshold. What lay ahead was unknown, but for the first time in a long while, both Jack and Ayanna felt ready to face it. They had found something precious in each other, something that went beyond the moments of cruelty and pain. It was a shared understanding, a bond forged in the fires of their struggles. The figure on the ridge, who had delivered justice with such quiet power, was now a distant memory, but his presence had left a lasting impression. He had come to right a wrong, to restore balance, and in doing so, had given both Jack and Ayanna the courage to stand tall. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the two of them continued their journey. The landscape, once filled with shadows and uncertainty, now seemed full of possibility. Together they would carve out a future, one that would honor the justice they had fought for and the peace they had longed for. The road ahead was long, but they were no longer walking alone. The road ahead seemed endless, but for Jack and Ayanna, it was a road filled with newfound hope. They walked in silence for a while, the weight of the journey lifting with each step. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground, but there was something about the evening light that felt different. It wasn't just the fading sun, it was the sense that they were walking towards something greater than themselves. Jack glanced over at Ayanna, his gaze softening as he took in the quiet strength she carried. She had faced so much, yet here she was, walking beside him with purpose. He realized that she wasn't just a survivor, she was a force, and in a way, so was he. Together, they had crossed a threshold, one that marked the end of their old lives and the beginning of something new. They had been shaped by the hardships they had faced, but those hardships no longer defined them. As they continued their journey, Jack couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. They had faced a moment of reckoning, a moment where justice had been served, but what about the future? Could they truly leave behind the ghosts of the past, the struggles that had brought them here? His thoughts were interrupted by Ayanna's voice, soft but steady. "Do you ever wonder if we'll find peace?" she asked, her eyes focused ahead, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken fears. Jack took a deep breath, the question settling in his chest. "I think we've already found it," he said quietly. "Not in the way we expected, maybe, but in how we choose to move forward. In how we choose to be who we are, not defined by what's happened to us." Ayanna looked over at him, her expression thoughtful. For a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable and unspoken. They had found something deeper than mere survival. They had found understanding. "Maybe you're right," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe peace is something we carry with us, not something we find out there." Jack nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always thought of peace as something distant, something that could only be found after fighting through all the chaos. But now, standing beside Ayanna, he realized that peace was something internal, something that could be nurtured even in the midst of uncertainty. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple, they came to a small rise in the land. The view stretched out before them, an open expanse of rolling hills, dotted with clusters of trees and the occasional stream. It was a peaceful scene, and for the first time, Jack allowed himself to truly appreciate the beauty of it. He had spent so many years running, avoiding, hiding from the world, but now, standing here with Ayanna, he saw it differently. This was their world now. A world where they could write their own stories, free from the past that had once held them captive. Ayanna turned to him, her eyes reflecting the soft light of the setting sun. "We've made it this far," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "And we'll keep going." Jack smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Together, they continued walking, side by side, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. No longer defined by the past, they moved forward with a shared strength and a bond that could not be broken. And as the night began to settle in, the stars starting to twinkle in the vast, open sky, they felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, that had eluded them both for so long. The road ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, they were ready to walk it, hand in hand, with hope in their hearts.